So we're not going to do the standard Twitter space free-for-all. We are going to answer some questions that have been set already. And then once we're finished, we'll throw it out to the floor for some more questions. We'll just wait for our guests to all arrive. Hey, Spanners, how are you? Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear.
Is it okay? Because it's hooked into my podcasting setup.
Yeah, so it doesn't sound as good as it does on the podcast, but we can hear you loud and clear. It's,
I have alternatives. If it's too distorted, I've got alternatives.
No, it's not distorted. It's not distorted. It doesn't have the rich, deep sound that we're using.
All right, I'll work on it. Anyway, nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for giving me top billing over Summers. He's the worst one, honestly.
Well, he's not here yet, is he? So
no. Well, look, Bryson's here. Well, let's just replace him forever.
Yeah. So we have a couple of tech guys who we might let loose to fight each other. Summers is here right now.
As I was saying, Summers is the foremost expert in Formula One tech. I just admire the guy.
We also have someone who, according to Twitter, doesn't know anything about Formula One and needs to go and do some research. Sean, the Statman Kelly, coming along potentially at some point. He's just messaged me to let me know he's at his hotel at Silverstone. And
that was hilarious.
Hopefully drop in. Hi, Summers. Hi, Bryson. We've got a tech tour de force here, which is important because, as Summers tweeted a moment ago, I think there's a bunch of new regulations that just dropped today. So I don't know anything about them at all, Spanners. I don't know if you do, but I think...
I understand Alpine has a new floor and that Williams are making fantasy claims about being a second faster. So, I mean, I can give you my full input on that right now if you want, which is nope.
Yeah, so actually, I mean, we may as well just kick off with a really unimportant topic whilst we're waiting for everyone to arrive. Technical people, are the Williams claims remotely true? Are they going to find a second with this new Red Bull-inspired concept? And how exciting is Alpine's new floor?
I was going to defer to Summers. I'm quite curious to see what his thoughts are on these claims because I also heard them and responded to them in an equally comical fashion. But we'll see what Summers says.
Well, anytime anybody really tries to claim that they're going to gain a second, I think you're going to get that kind of response, aren't you? But I think the thing to bear in mind here is two things. Firstly, there's only going to be one set of these parts available, and it's going to be on Albon's car to test them. And secondly, they're so far off the pace as it is anyway that it's not really, I suppose, out the realms of possibility that you could get a big jump. I'm still not convinced it's going to be a second, but it could be a fairly sizable jump.
So we saw Aston Martin obviously appeared with a Red Bull, very heavily Red Bull inspired concept. Certainly resembled it very, very closely, and they didn't seem to make any noticeable step. Is it going to be a similar thing? Do you think it's going to just look like the Red Bull?
Well, the problem that you've got there is that I think that there's a difference in reference point with Aston Martin because it's taken a while for them to actually understand the new concept as well. So you've not got an immediacy in performance available to them because when you make such a conceptual change, it does take time for them to be able to understand what's going on and how to get the best performance from the setup of the car as well, in tune with these new parts that have arrived. But obviously, if Williams have gone down the Red Bull route, they could suffer in similar terms as to what Aston did in trying to get the best from those new parts, I guess.
And I don't know whether we need to devote any time to the Alpine floor, but that's a thing that they have, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with floors, and I think that's kind of overlooked a little bit this season, is weight. The amount of weight that are in these floors because they're such a vast part of the car. So potentially there could be some gains in that respect as well as obviously aerodynamic performance. We've seen a lot of teams trending towards certain types of designs with the floor edge devices that they've got. Teams are now starting to do similar things in terms of what they're doing with the strakes at the front edge of the floor. And obviously you know what a bib wing is, obviously Bryson will know what I mean by a bib wing. Alpine recently installed one of those. So, these are things that they're like a daisy chain. When you put one part into the system, you then have to make other changes downstream to be able to maximise the performance. So it's not just one big leap all at once.
Yeah.
Oh, God,
go ahead,
sorry,
Spanish.
No, I was just saying Summers is overcomplicating everything. What you do is you just get some clippers and you just hack out bits of the floor. So I was wondering what Summers thought of that. I do love the on-the-fly sort of element of engineering. It does kind of like a hark back to an old F1. And Mercedes have got form for this, haven't they, Summers? Like when there wasn't enough cooling in Singapore, I think in 2015, and they just start hacking bits off the car. I love it when teams do that.
Yeah, and we also saw that in Jeddah when they brought their modified rear wing with the trailing edge cutaway. That was like literally a previous wing that they had cut away to reduce drag. But this question of the floors in Alpine, it reminds me of earlier in the season.
Spanish, did you potentially mute everyone by
I did. Sorry about that. Yeah. I didn't. You made me a co-host, and I've immediately messed it up. First time. Carry on, Bryson. Sorry,
Spanners. I appreciate you've got like no hosting experience, no broadcast experience. So we'll get you up to speed. Don't worry.
Okay, sorry.
There was a question earlier on in the season before the floor stays were officially allowed as to whether or not teams had made their floors strong enough to be, structurally strong enough to not flex under load. I seem to remember Alpine having a floor that was heavier than it needed to be, precisely for the reason of avoiding the ability to flex, and that the floor stays were being allowed to be added to the cars. They had to redesign a new floor that was structurally lighter, but was making advantage of those stays. So it's an interesting question that seems to be developing over time.
So I have a question, and this is to our technical side of the panel. What are the new rules that have been decided today? Because this is a bit of this has surprised me. I think I kind of knew something was coming and completely forgot, and then Summers mentioned it. So we should probably get up to speed with what's going on.
Yeah, I think Scarbs shared a tweet about it.
Both things, deflection tests on the rear wings. So you've not only got a different plot to the.
We're just losing you a bit, actually, Summers. Are you able to relocate to somewhere other than the Isle of Wight?
Thanks, Spanners.
No worries. We just lost your signal a bit there.
The other thing is the beam wing. They've made quite a substantial change to the load that can be applied to the beam wing under the deflection test. So previously, the trailing edge could flex by up to 5 millimeters with a 60 Newton load, and they've increased that to 150 Newtons and only 3 millimeters of flex. So either somebody has been doing something pretty tricky in that area, or the FIA have just kind of looked at it and thought, well, we were perhaps a bit too lax on what we gave the teams in terms of the previous deflection tests.
And do we have any news on the rules that they were trying to form to stop people from allowing their cars to porpoise as much? Yeah.
Okay, so basically, from my understanding of the situation that unfolded at the last race, the FIA tried to introduce these new regulations via a technical directive, which, as we all know, a technical directive is not a regulation, and that's what a lot of the teams basically came out and said. This isn't on. Technical directives are not regulations, and we're not going to work to them. Those things haven't been introduced into this new draft of the regulations that have been ratified today. So there's still some scope for things to change in that respect. And I think one of the biggest issues that came up from that whole scenario at the last race was the fact of this additional metal stay that was added to the Mercedes and then subsequently removed after there's a big argument about it. But yeah, as we all know, porpoising is a major issue, and I do think there will be more done in the future. But these new changes in this regulation set don't actually resolve any of those issues.
So, unless there's any more technical queries about the new rules, I don't know, Spanners. Yeah, go on, Spanners. Go for it.
It was technical questions, but not specifically about the new rules, if that's okay, but pertinent to Silverstone. Summers mentioned in a tweet that the tyre pressures, and get this, guys, are going to be an incredible 23 psi, which is either incredibly high or incredibly low. But the fact that he tweeted about it means it's significant. So my question to you, Summers, is this tyre pressure, is it good? And you know full well what I mean by is it good? So don't make me say it. Is this good news? Does it help?
Just to put that into perspective, a normal road car, for those of you who don't check their tyre pressures or don't do it in PSI, a hot hatch road car, Volkswagen Golf GTI, runs between 35 to 39-ish PSI as like a manufacturer recommended pressure. So this is still super low compared to most road cars, but compared to single-seaters with big balloony kind of slick tyres, it's pretty high to keep the structure nice and rigid and prevent failures, I assume, Summers?
Yeah, I mean, first off, Spanner's kind of right. He's 23 psi, but that's at the rear. The fronts are 26 psi. And as we've seen in Silverstone before, most of the reason why Pirelli increased the tyre pressures is to protect the tyres, because we've obviously seen these major issues unfold at Silverstone before because of the high loadings that they have at that circuit. It is the highest I think we've probably ever seen from Pirelli. So there might even be some margin for them to move them down slightly, having got the information from free practice on Friday, because we do see that from time to time. But this is some information that I tweet out prior to every single race, because obviously Pirelli put them out there. In terms of what Spanners is asking, is it good? I don't think it's really good or bad news for anybody, because it's something that has an effect on everybody. It just depends on how each car and each driver uses the tyres throughout the course of a stint or the race. One thing that it might do is increase the amount of understeer, which Pirelli have already mentioned that next year's generation of tyres will be less susceptible to understeer, because they've had some pretty horrific feedback from the drivers from this year's tyres.
From Verstappen. Verstappen's like the only driver I've heard complaining about that.
I think Verstappen's the only one that has had any news around it. I don't think he's the only one that has complained about it.
That doesn't fit my narrative, so I reject that. But it's not going to be a repeat of like 2013, where, say, for example, like the tyres were exploding because they didn't have stiff sidewalls, but also that specifically didn't suit Red Bull, because was it something like, because they squished so much, it was changing the aerodynamic profile of the Red Bull package. So when they managed to get the harder tyres with the harder sidewalls, it suited their aero package better. The thing that bothers me, quote unquote, bothers me here, is that if it does make a big difference to performance, whether it's understeery, oversteery, affects the balance. Pirelli have got an awful lot of power, especially over the course of a weekend. Could they just see it on Friday? What's to stop them going, it's not really fitting my favourite team, so I'll crank the pressures even higher or lower.
Okay, so to do a Matt Trumpets in this situation, there's two things that I'm going to say about here. First off, 2013 is, in my opinion, one of the biggest travesties in Formula One in a very long time, because we had basically a mid-season switch of tyre construction. The tyres that the teams had used up until Silverstone had been a very different construction to the ones that we finished the season with. And essentially the reason that the switch was made is that all of the teams were tyre swapping, i.e. they were running left-hand tyres on the right-hand side of the car and right-hand tyres on the left-hand side, because it gave them an aerodynamic advantage. At that point in the regulations, Pirelli weren't allowed to specify that they couldn't be run that way. And so their only means of actually correcting that was to change the specification of the tyre entirely. And as we know, that led to Red Bull going on to dominate.
Wait, but Summers,
Yep.
Christian Horner told me that it would be unfair to have a mid-season regulation change which benefited one team.
Have you not seen my tweets about ironic behaviour regarding those statements?
Sorry, continue.
If we look at this year in terms of what Pirelli can actually do, as I mentioned, they can make changes on the fly throughout the course of a race weekend, and they do that, and they have done that throughout the course of the season so far. They tend to raise tyre pressures, not lower tyre pressures throughout the course of a weekend, because their simulations will suggest something close to what is actually going to happen. But when you get the actual physical data from the track, you do tend to see that there's higher loadings than what the tyres and the tyre pressures have been in correlation to what they expected them to be. So we have seen a couple of times this season that pressures have gone up by half or 1 psi. And hopefully that doesn't happen at Silverstone, because honestly, I think I run my road tyre pressures lower than what we've currently got on these tyres this weekend anyway.
Go for it, Bryson.
I was just going to add, Silverstone has always been the type of track that destroys tires. I mean, even thinking back to 2020, when we had, was it Kvyat, I believe, had a failure, and Sainz had a failure, or was it, I think it was Sainz, and then, Bottas and Hamilton, all had failures. I seem to remember, of course, Hamilton famously winning a race on 3 tires. And I mean, whenever you have a regulation change, this is the first time when we actually have this new wheel and tire combination at this circuit. I can kind of understand Pirelli being somewhat conservative there.
So this kind of segues into one of our questions that we've got in my little list of questions, which I haven't actually shared with the panel, but it's okay. They're not very complicated, which is, we've heard this a lot of kind of hype around this. Will the characteristics of Silverstone suit the package that Mercedes are going to bring to this weekend? And in that, I also mean the upgraded package, which you may have something to talk about there. I don't know exactly what the upgrades are, but I have heard some noises from Brackley about some improvements, some performance improvements, not just the fact that the track is smoother and more likely to suit their car.
Yeah, I was just going to say briefly, I'm not privy to all of the fine details of exactly what Mercedes is bringing, although a certain part of that, my understanding is that weight is going to be a factor. And the thing about weight reduction is that really benefits you everywhere. It's not really track specific. And it helps in turning, it helps in acceleration, braking, anything you can do to cut kilos is gonna benefit you on top of anything else that's circuit specific that may suit your particular package. Now, you mentioned that there are new upgrades coming. We say the word upgrade as if it's some sort of like law of nature. It just means it's different, right? It's supposed to be better for the car, but it may not actually be. There may be a correlation issue between CFD and the wind tunnel and the actual track. So the first question is, do the upgrades actually work? And if they do work, do they understand them enough to be able to apply them for this particular race? I think their chances are good. I think their chances are better than perhaps some of the other tracks that were a bit bumpier. But there are no guarantees in the sport, so we'll just have to wait and see how things play out.
What a pessimistic picture Bryson paints. Let me lay this out in a much more positive point of view for anyone who would happen to be wishing well for Mercedes, Brad. Let's see. The factors are it's smooth, and if we look to Baku, where Toto Wolff was saying, yes, what we've done, our fix that kind of worked at Barcelona isn't really working at the bumpy track. So obviously then we had to endure Monaco and then Baku and then Montreal, all very bumpy tracks. So everyone's been looking to Silverstone as a baseline. They've cut that fancy new hole in the side pod, so that'll help. Plus they're bringing this upgrade package, which let's grant them that they actually managed to improve things. I think the odds of there being a significant step up, also if the understeer doesn't suit Max Verstappen, for example, with these higher tyre pressures, the odds are sort of slightly in the favour of maybe a Mercedes upset here. I think the weather looks a little cooler than other races as well, and Mercedes tend to do a little bit better when it's cooler. So I'm having a little cheeky look online at the odds. Lewis Hamilton 10-1. And when you paint my positive picture that they will definitely win, I think that's a bit of a bargain. The Ferraris will take themselves out of it, as Ferrari are wont to do. So they've only got to beat Verstappen. So that's, I think, a definite win, Brad. That's what I'm looking at. With all those factors, how can they not win?
Obviously, a nice home supporting crowd as well. I'm really interested to see what the support level is like for each of the British drivers, because I don't know if you remember, Spanners, when we were living it up in VIP hospitality,
Ferrari
in the Paddock
hospitality
Club last year on the qualifying day. There was a massive amount of support for George Russell, like pre-Mercedes works driver days.
Yeah.
He would get through to the next session in qualifying for the Williams. I'm pretty sure I'm not misremembering this. And there was a massive cheer from the crowd, like massive. Now, I appreciate they're probably also supporting the underdog a bit and happy to see, a slower car progress. But I've got a feeling that George Russell's going to have like kind of 50% of the home support, despite
it could be split.
Hamilton being like the incumbent popular driver.
Look, Lewis Hamilton's massively popular. If you go on social media or you listen to like mainstream media, you would kind of get the impression sometimes that Lewis is a somewhat derided or ridiculed figure. He is like a massively popular F1 driver, and it's mad that you even have to kind of repeat that. But he is really adored in the UK, and I think sometimes people outside of the UK don't quite realise how popular Lewis Hamilton is. But I think the Brits have always been good at getting behind their drivers. If you go back to the 80s and 90s, and even up to Jenson Button, you have to remind yourself it used to be okay to be British and support a British driver. That's only really changed with Lewis Hamilton, and then suddenly it's Brit bias. But I think the British do always get behind their drivers. So I think Albon and Norris will enjoy some support as well. And I doubt very much whether it will be a George Russell versus Lewis Hamilton. I don't see the fan space kind of going in that direction. So, like a lot of the Kubica fans instantly hated George Russell. I don't think that's happening at the moment with the Russell-Hamilton partnership. But what the British fans also love doing is a little bit of pantomime. And I don't know how the rest of the panel feels about this, but I remember being there in 2013 and Vettel pulled up, I think on the home straight. So just going into Abbey, turn one, and he pulled up with an engine failure, and he got a very kind of a mild-mannered boo. It wasn't like hissing and pelting him with eggs. It was a pantomime boo, and I've never really kind of minded that. The question that people have been asking is, what sort of reception is Verstappen going to get? And I think you need to brace yourselves for some pantomime booing at Silverstone.
So on that topic, I was at the race. I can't remember what year it was, but someone can tell me, where Schumacher broke his leg or legs at Stowe. And I was sat at, I guess it would have been club, kind of looking across, and we all saw Schumacher go into the wall on lap one. We had no idea he was injured, just saw that Schumacher was off. And I remember distinctly an enormous cheer from the crowd. So again, at that time, Schumacher was the pantomime villain. And I'm told from a couple of pretty reliable sources that Senna used to be that pantomime villain as well. We used to have Senna as a British crowd, and would cheer his defeats or downfall. So
you need a baddie, don't you? But I've always sort of saw that as part of sport. And then there's a line between that, like a good-natured pantomime villain, and some of the receptions say that Lewis Hamilton has got at Barcelona. There's a line to it, but to me that's inherent to sport. Bryson, I think, like a non-UK point of view might help us here. What do the US like? Do they like a pantomime villain?
We certainly have pantomime villains and players that are known to be kind of have an edge, but to be honest, I'm a terrible fan of everything. It's like American in terms of sports. That's like not F1. I watch F1 almost all the time. I pay attention to baseball as well, but outside of that, not that much.
So just going to take this opportunity, because we've got a lot of new listeners here since I said this originally. in case anyone thinks we're ignoring their hands up or request to talk, the way we're running this one is we've got our panel and we've got a few preset questions that we're going to discuss and answer. And once we've finished those, and don't worry, it's not too long. We don't have a giant list of things to talk about. We're then going to open up to the floor to get some kind of listener questions. So just before we move on to one of our next topics, I just wanted to finish up on Silverstone as a race, the layout of Silverstone and the kind of how conducive it is to a good race. How crucial do we think qualifying is this weekend? Because one thing I've heard Spanners mention on Missed Apex this year is that this is probably the season where qualifying has mattered the least for quite some time.
I think that the whole era, like the last few years, and even like the hybrid era, I noticed distinctly in 2015. If you remember 2014, it was quite close actually between Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg, and then in 2015 they brought in a qualifying trophy which brought attention to it. But I don't know if people forget, or it's not really talked about, that there was a gearbox failure in 2014 in the last race at Abu Dhabi, which was double points for whatever reason, and had the gearbox failure been on Hamilton's car instead of Rosberg would have picked up that title. But Hamilton changed his approach, it seemed, in qualifying. Rosberg won the qualifying trophy in 2015, yet Hamilton would overtake him on track race after race and really dominated him in 2015 and arguably 2016, but we can have that fight another time. But yeah, I think this era of Formula One, increasingly, even year on year, qualifying is obviously useful on the right tracks and street circuits, but once we get out of the street circuit bog that we've been in, qualifying just isn't the be all and end all in Formula One anymore, especially at a track like Silverstone where you can pass, especially at a track like Silverstone, as Bryson said, might eat the tyres, and you're going to get a lot of strategy, and it isn't necessarily the track where you want to exclusively set up for qualifying. So I think we'll see qualifying and it'll be fine. But I don't think that will tell us necessarily who's going to do better on race day. And I'll tell you what, it's Verstappen this season, Brad, that seems to just not set up for qualifying at all.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I don't think he's not trying in qualifying. I think it actually hurts him when he's not on pole. But it's not a case of the weekend is over if you're not on pole. It's quite not easy, but it's absolutely possible to make a pass on track seemingly this season. And anywhere, if you can do that anywhere, Silverstone is a great place. In fact, multiple opportunities, one of which is actually into Cops, although some people would have you believe that's an impossible place to overtake fairly. So, okay. Sorry, Summers, go for it. Before I move the conversation slightly, go for it, Summers.
Okay, so I'm going to say something here that people might either agree with or disagree with, or might not have even considered. But one thing that has annoyed me about this season in terms of qualifying and race strategy is the deletion of the Q3 tyre rule. Because for me, it feels like it's disadvantaged the midfield at a point when we really needed the midfield to close up to those at the front. So if you don't know what I'm talking about here in terms of the Q3 rule, you used to have to start the race on the Q2 tyre that you'd got into Q3 with. And I think that's kind of changed the entire strategy, the way teams approach setting up for qualifying and the race. And it just seems to me that it's disadvantaged the teams that might have been able to cling on and make it difficult for those out front in terms of the strategic pit window.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. I mean, I never really understood what the motivation was behind changing that rule to begin with, but maybe it was some sort of variability that they were expecting to see. But yeah, I think I can get on board with the idea of the previous version being good in its own way and this version being somewhat different.
And I have no strong opinion on that one way or the other. I thought we had quite a good reason for changing it originally, but maybe you're swaying me back the other way. I thought it had kind of lost its potency, that the whole point of the rule had kind of fallen by the wayside, and they were changing it because it was making things too predictable. Am I miles off there?
No, I do think that was perhaps their intent, but I think based on the way that these cars perform, I just think that the old way of doing things might have actually continued to improve the way in which that the teams, performed from the midfield. I think, these cars were heralded in a certain way, and in some respects, I don't think they've entirely delivered everything that was expected of them. And quickly, just going back to the discussion that we were having earlier about rule changes, there is one quite important one in the sporting regulations that I've noticed, that they're actually going to trial a new qualifying style at 2 races next year. There's no real determination as to what that is yet, apart from I've seen that Q1 must be on hard tyres, Q2 must be on medium tyres, and Q3 must be on the softest of tyres. But I think there might be some other variation involved, but they've added that into the sporting regs for next year at least.
Okay, interesting. And that's something I hadn't really thought about, is that maybe if they just held on to the rule, this generation of cars actually might have fit it a bit better, that qualifying tyre rule. Anyway, I think we're going to move on to something a bit more current affairs. And Spanner's kind of warned me not to put this right at the start, so he was probably pretty right there. We deliberately have avoided this. And
you need some fluff, Brad, at the beginning before you go in.
Yeah, we've done the nice bits. We've done the racy bits. And now we're going to talk about Nelson Piquet. And I'm not afraid to say his name. We've got a new speaker who's... Sorry,
I think we've just lost Brad there.
My fiance decided to call me right at that point, despite me telling her that I was doing this. So we've got Nyasha, and that's how you say it. I know how to say people's names properly, I think, maybe, who has actually produced a couple of very good videos in the last week or so on the Quick Stop F1 YouTube channel. Go and check them out. One of them specifically pertaining to this current news story, which has moved on at pace over the last 24 hours or so. And that is Nelson Piquet saying horrible stuff a little while ago now, but it coming to light recently, and all of the fallout and connotations from that. But just before we talk about it specifically, hi Nyasha, say hello to everyone.
Hello, how's it going? Can everyone hear me?
We can hear you. So
I only have one AirPod in. I lost the other one, so that's where we are right now.
Go to the last place where you had it, and then it will be there.
Check your other ear, man. That's where it is.
Check my ear. Yeah, that's a good one. I could do that. But yeah, no, I'm glad you guys can hear me. Glad to be here, and I was really enjoying the fluff piece. So thanks, guys, for that.
Yeah, I was also enjoying the fluff piece. I just thought we can't have an F1 pre-British Grand Prix discussion without touching upon this particular subject. And not that anyone's going to have missed this, but basically just to fill everyone in on what's gone on today, Nelson Piquet has apologised, in inverted commas.
Did he?
For the comments,
Did he?
For the comments he made. And essentially, from what I can glean, he said, yeah, I'm sorry if you were offended, but actually you just misunderstood what this word means. And when I say it, or people in my circle say it, we don't mean it in a bad way. I just specifically chose that word, which has certain connotations, because, just at random, I would have called anyone that. It doesn't have anything to do with the skin colour of the person that I was slagging off at the time. So I don't know what the panel feel about that. I know this probably is quite a short bit of the discussion because it's not really
maybe
a lot to talk about.
Well, I mean, like I tweeted earlier, for this to be plausible, he would also have to be either totally unaware or totally uncaring that it might sound as if he was using the most famous offensive word probably in the history of man. Is that the most sort of offensive words that exists right now? And he was using that term at the exact type of person that term is offensive towards. So he was specifically saying it to Lewis Hamilton. So is he completely unaware of it, that there's a coincidence that of these words that is apparently just an endearing thing his grandmother used to say? He speaks good English. He's aware those words exist. It strains plausibility. And then in any case, that apology wasn't an apology at all. He said, I want to clear up what I said earlier. Yeah, maybe it was a bit ill thought out, but actually I didn't do it. You've all misunderstood. You're all wrong. But I do feel bad if anybody was incorrectly offended. So it was a non-apology on top of what seems like an obviously pretty disgusting comment.
So Nyasha and Bryson?
Do you want to go first, Bryson? You had your hands.
Look, that response was tepid at best. I mean, here is the situation. At this moment in time, I do not respect Nelson Piquet. However, I would have respected him more if he had taken ownership of the statements that he made and the context in which he made them, and made a commitment to future growth and understanding of the gravity of the situation that he put himself in. Instead, his strategic move seems to have been, actually, you don't understand what I said. And I would challenge him to explain to other Brazilians why they are upset about what he said. Right? Don't even pretend to play this "you didn't understand what I said" game. It doesn't make any sense, and it won't stand up to scrutiny. So suffice it to say, I'm not happy with that, but I'm moving on with my life, frankly.
Yeah, he's just like another one in a long line of really odious old white men in the sport, which we just kind of have to unfortunately come across and deal with. And to be honest, like for us, you know, we're fans of the sport, and we kind of look at it and you know, it's awful. But like this, the disrespect against Lewis Hamilton that this sport has is incredible, considering that he's literally bigger than the sport in terms of popularity and social currency. And you know, if you look at his achievements on track, taking that all apart, he doesn't even deserve anything that's happened. But the fact that we're looking at within a week, I think we had Jackie Stewart tell him to retire. I think we had Bernie Ecclestone come out of his cryo chamber to say something, and then we've had Nelson Piquet thing come up in the space of a week before his home Grand Prix. Like, it is insane, and it's just incredible that not only that we have to kind of bring light to these things and make sure there's enough attention on it that teams and drivers would support Lewis, but it's also incredible that in the face of that, whenever people try and say and talk about it, there's this backlash of like, well, you know, he didn't mean it like that, or, you know, maybe it wasn't racist. And it's indicative of a wider trend in the world of how racism is kind of viewed at the moment. And I think I guess maybe like the redeeming thing is that so many people have kind of stood up to it within the community, which is really cool. But what a prick, honestly.
Now, what do you really think?
Yeah, that was me calm. So yeah.
I've just got one more thing on that, Brad, and I'm glad Nash has picked up on the other personalities that routinely criticise Lewis Hamilton. I think it's time that we can have a grown-up conversation and say this without kind of fear, which is an awful lot of the negative criticism of Lewis Hamilton is racially motivated. And you hear someone say, "Oh, Lewis Hamilton, he just loves his fashion. He's distracted. All he wants is his dog and to walk on catwalks." And you go, I think that guy's comments might be racially motivated. And they go, you're playing the race card. He's just talking about fashion and dogs. And I think we just need to grow up and just realize that sustained criticism of a black person can sometimes is a red flag of it being racially motivated. And then it's the same people that are then going after Naomi Schiff. And then it's the same people that will go after the next black athlete or black presenter in Formula One. So I think, cases like this, where you have people who are anti, say Lewis Hamilton, and then they have the moment where the true colours show through and the racism shows through. and then you finally connect the dots. You don't have to always wait until they are horribly and openly racist to start going, hey, come on, let's look at a pattern of behavior here and start having a grown-up conversation that black athletes or non-white athletes and drivers and media personalities are under more pressure and more criticism than their white counterparts.
And before we move this on to hopefully a more positive topic, talking about a pattern of behavior, I don't want to labor on this too much, but is there a pattern of behavior at a particular organization? And I know people are going to say PK doesn't speak for the team that
Lol,
he is
I'm out.
indirectly connected with through his daughter dating their star driver, etc. But there is a particular team that, on just to put this in context, on the day that they probably should have been coming out in support of Lewis Hamilton and maybe, like a lot of other teams and drivers did, saying something in support, instead they were having to make statements about one of their drivers doing a racist thing and saying that they're releasing him from a contract, on top of having to sack staff who have been posting things online, on top of some of the family members of their driver, a star driver, and other top management having alignment with far right political figures. There seems to be something kind of culturally around a particular team that feels, at the very least to me, a little bit off, and it makes me not want to support. It doesn't feel so wholesome to me. Maybe I've gone too far, but that's the kind of
Van Gene will take this. I'll just take I need to get a cup of tea, Brad.
So I deliberately wasn't going to this person called Van Gene because it sounds Dutch and it's probably a Max Verstappen troll account.
Hello, guys. I'm going to be really, really quick because I'm just doing other things right now, and I'm taking a massive swerve from what you just commented about because I don't need that in my DMs. But on the Nelson Piquet thing, this isn't sort of out of form for Nelson Piquet either. He's done some really nasty things in his time in the sport. He had an interview years ago, asked if he was a better driver than Senna, and he said, well, I'm still alive, which is like, bite the back of your hand.
Blimey, jeez.
And I think when him and Mansell were teammates and they had their notorious rivalry, there was reports of him sending people to intimidate Mansell's family. Not to do anything, but just to intimidate, just to make things worse. So he has a history of being not a nice person in the slightest.
Well, we may have covered all of this topic. I was hoping that F1 virtual statman Sean Kelly would have, a database of other horrible things that Nelson Piquet has done that we could slag him off for. But I think he's probably researching. He told me he was deep in Formula 2 hell, which means having to do a load of work. Basically, Sean he's covering F1, F2, F3, W Series, and Formula E this weekend, and trying to kind of join us in this space at the same time. But if he gets a moment, he will probably pop his head in and answer some questions. But maybe let's move on to a different topic that's in the questions here, which I mean, this is tangentially connected because one of the team that I was alluding to is involved in it. This is the question: is the title race already over? Have Red Bull stolen so much of a march that there's no coming back from this without some extreme bad luck? Any thoughts, panel?
I do have thoughts about this, and this is something that I commented on, I think, a couple of days ago. It's an interesting quirk of history that Red Bull was engaged in an incredible title fight towards the end of the season, bringing developments, seemingly every race, at least up until Qatar, and yet managed to produce a car at the beginning of the season that was competitive from day one and had an incredible development potential that can absolutely fight for the championship. That is an incredible achievement from that team. And you add to that the strategic aggressiveness that Red Bull is known for and the ability to sort of think on their feet and be aggressive in that way. They are extremely tough to beat and even under different situations. And so if you add to that the reliability improvements they've been making over time. They don't seem to be stumbling in quite the same way. Yeah, they are going to be an extremely difficult team to beat, and it will not be possible for Ferrari or whoever to beat them if points are left on the table. So I don't think that the championship is necessarily done, especially considering the reliability issues that we've seen thus far. But I do think that the momentum that they're building is significant, and if something doesn't change quickly, yeah, they could potentially run away with it.
Go for it,
God
Summers.
save
Oh,
us all
sorry,
if
Nash.
that happens. Oh, sorry. Did I? Sorry, I don't want to interrupt. After you.
No,
Sorry.
no. I was just I just saw a hand up. Sorry, Nasha. Anyone talk that wants to talk? Go for it.
Okay, cool. I was just saying, God save us all. I do. Look, it does look a bit ominous, but I guess the reliability issues that plagued Red Bull, are still around. Like, just because it hasn't happened to Verstappen's car specifically doesn't mean it won't happen. And obviously, just because Ferrari obviously have had those issues, they've just come now, so they're both going to drop more points. And then obviously you've got the engine penalties that they're going to get later in the season as well, coupled with the fact that Mercedes are just about to come through with an absolute rocket ship and finish 1-2 in most of the races. So who knows? It could be a pretty close title race. I just think I think we're just over a third of the way through. So it's still not guaranteed that they've already got it, but it does look ominous. I think, like Bryson said, as a team, I think when it comes to strategy, the difference between them and Ferrari, when it comes to strategy and I guess just the weekend running, you don't think that Red Bull will drop the ball. Let's say if it's changeable weather conditions or qualifying or in the race, if they have to do strategy calls or chuck one of their drivers under the bus for Max. Whereas with Ferrari, it's still a bit up in the air. So they've got to sort that side out for it to be as close as I guess we all want it to be. But it's too early. It's too early.
So we do now have Sean Kelly, virtual F1 statman, if I've said that correctly. Sean, statistically, has anyone ever come back from a deficit this big? Is this a normal situation that we see turned around in the past, or is this kind of getting towards statistically this isn't going to happen? Red Bull have got it already.
Well, first off, hi, Brad, because I was trying like hell to join this conversation. It turns out you can't do it when you're using the web version of Twitter. So there you go. Fun fact, you've got to use your phone.
I was adding you loads, Sean. I thought you were ignoring us.
And I was
No,
too. I
I
was
was
adding
thinking,
as a co-host and all sorts.
Right, I was sitting here completely oblivious. It didn't give me any messages or anything. But here we are now. All's well in the world.
Welcome.
So, in answer to your question, thank you. In answer to your question, is this an untenable situation? It wasn't an untenable situation after Australia. Charles Leclerc led Verstappen by 46 points, and even then, the obituaries on Red Bull's season were starting to be written. Like, Ferrari are going to run away with this, and now here we are in a situation where Leclerc is 49 points behind Verstappen. So it's not. It hasn't been an untenable situation within this season. We've got so many races to go. Having been, a third of the way into it, there's still so much that can happen. I mean, it's lazy to think that Red Bull are anywhere close to sealing this. I mean, I accept that Sainz is a bit adrift there. 73 points off the championship, but it's the quiet part out loud here is that Red Bull have had more in-race mechanical failures this season than have Ferrari. The difference is that Ferraris have come when they've been leading the race. So it seems like Ferrari have been victims of misfortune more than have Red Bull, when in actual fact, Ferrari have been in a winning position when it's gone wrong. So therefore, you would assume Ferrari at some point will be in a winning position again. And Canada was somewhat influenced by the fact that Leclerc had all those penalties. So we never saw him at the front of the field. So it's everything to play for.
So you're saying there's a chance, to quote
I'm
Dumb and Dumber.
I'm not saying there's a chance. I'm saying there's every chance that this is not over. Don't hand the title to Verstappen yet. There's a lot of racing still to do.
And Summers has had his hand up for a while. Go for it, Summers.
Okay, well, first off, the reason I haven't been speaking much is because Spaces has this weird thing of basically when people are added, I can't hear them. So I've not heard anything Sean said, anything Van Gene said, or Nasha, but I've got closed captions on, so I'm trying to keep up that way. Anyway, there's one thing to think about here that we haven't touched on, and that's the cost cap and the way that is going to affect development throughout the course of the rest of the season. And if Ferrari are anybody to be believed, then obviously Red Bull have already spent all of their fake tokens so far this season and probably won't have much more to do in terms of development on the car, whereas we might still see stuff from Ferrari. And on top of that, I don't really believe we've seen the full potential of Ferrari's power unit yet, and we still have potentially an ERS upgrade coming for Ferrari that could put them back in touch as well.
Another team that mentioned they were up against it in terms of the cost cap were McLaren this week. I think it was Andreas Seidel in an interview said that development was effectively paused, I think, because McLaren had kind of hit the wall or were about to. Is that something you could comment on, Simon?
Yeah, so I think it's something that's going to afflict everybody, especially the teams that are UK based because of the inflation side of things. It's obviously been spoken about by Christian Horner quite a lot. I think all of the teams are considering the implications of changing or amending the cost cap, but there are teams out there that are able to operate under the current constraints, and so obviously they're going to want something in exchange to try to change things around. But I do think there might be some bargaining going on behind the scenes to try and change some of that.
And just before we move on to something potentially different, when does this get reset? At what point does the I know a certain team, I mean, maybe I'm kind of conflating two things, but in terms of wind tunnel time or CFD teraflops, at what point in the season does that kind of get reset so the teams that had previously done really well, that were limited on time, get more? And will that be irrelevant if they've got no more money to spend in the budget cap anyway?
Well, the reset takes place the 1st of July, so midnight on the end of June. And yeah, I mean, obviously it is going to be heavily dependent on the cost cap as to how you can play things out. But technically, you really should have been budgeting for this kind of position. You know, you should be thinking in advance of how you are going to use your CFD and wind tunnel allocation based upon the alteration of the championship positions. And obviously that would certainly play into Mercedes' hands, where they're in a position where they were operating on last year's championship position in the first part of the season and will be obviously looking at something different for the back end of the season. So it's not only what you perceive to be this year, though. You also have to consider the development for next year's car and how you offset that and when you start development, etc. So there's a lot of ways to consider both the cost cap and obviously the resource restrictions that are in place.
Now, the next topic, and we're nearly at the end of our panel only, we hoggle the conversation segment. But the next topic is really just our general predictions for Silverstone. But just before we do that, we have a request from someone who I asked to join us, the ever popular Engine Mode 11. So I'm just going to allow him in.
Oh, fuck that, I'm going.
I just going to allow him in to tell us just how screwed Red Bull are in terms of their budget, because I know he has a direct line to Horner and Marco and everyone on the inside there. So Dan, do you have any kind of feelers in the team still that can tell us whether Red Bull have got a load in reserve and we're just being overly optimistic for their downfall?
Well, it's all a compensation. They had to pay me to leave, so that's where all the money's gone. But no, I don't know. I in terms of monetary, I don't know.
You're useless, Dan. I don't know why we invited you on. So, panel.
You invited me.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, right. Cheers. Bye.
So, what was really funny, actually, a couple of people I invited on, both almost simultaneously told me, just putting the baby to bed, and then I'll try and be along. It was almost word for word the same. So all I can take from that is children are terrible and they should be banned.
They're terrible for the first 4 years. Then they're sort of okay. But I think you've picked the right path, Brad. To be honest,
Confirmed.
So, a couple of us are hoping to tag along to the event, the little event down on the border of Northampton and where is it, Buckinghamshire this weekend. There's some signs on the motorway are telling me that there's an event on this weekend and I should avoid the area. So I might have a little pop down and see what's going on.
Yeah, I might get to Towcester a bit later as well, Brad. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm hoping to see something exciting. I'm hoping just for the atmosphere, and not just because I am mildly biased towards Mercedes as a team that I largely support. I'm hoping it's going to be a better showing from the Brackley team. But what are our real predictions? Like, that may be a little bit pie in the sky, and I know we kind of touched upon this towards the beginning of the discussion, but I'm just going to put in a top three. So I think it's probably going to be, do I want to be optimistic or realistic? I think it's probably going to be Leclerc with his engine hanging on for once, Hamilton on the podium again, but I reckon Russell one step ahead on the podium in second place because something will happen to the Red Bulls. That's it. That's my prediction. I've locked it in. Leclerc, Russell, Hamilton. Someone else go.
Okay, I can throw some predictions in. Hello? I think I'm going to maintain my optimism that this will be not only a real step forward for Mercedes development-wise, but the fact that they did find some kind of fix, but they had to run too low to make it work on street tracks. So I'm actually going to go for a Mercedes win. And I'm going to say there's nothing to choose between George Russell and Lewis Hamilton. I genuinely think at the point that they're crossing over in their careers, we definitely haven't seen a Russell versus Hamilton comparison battle. The team have been very, very upfront and said Lewis Hamilton is doing a bunch of experiments. And then they have the luxury of having George Russell just there on kind of plan A as a benchmark, and that speaks to how much they trust him, how much talent he's got, and the fact he's been in the top 5 for 9 races in a row. It's been a dream start for him, given the lack of relative performance. So I'm going to be optimistic. I'm going to go for a Mercedes 1-2. Fernando Alonso, though, will be the dark horse, even though he will retire in an incident largely caused by his own actions on lap 20. It would have been a podium. It definitely would have been a podium. So that's what I'm going for. I'm going for the Alonso virtual podium that he will get robbed of, but he'll tell us that it would have been a podium.
Very interesting. Very interesting. I also believe this will be a better weekend for Mercedes. I'm not quite sure where they will come out, but I do think it'll be a relative improvement. I think people might be underestimating how good of a season Sergio Perez is having and how much more to his liking the current car design is. If you go back to 2021, he actually had a reasonably good qualifying then, but had a spin in the sprint race that kind of ruined his entire weekend. I think he might surprise some people today or this weekend as far as his performances in Silverstone.
Yeah, and I'd say, speaking to what Bryson's just mentioned, we all know who is the tyre whisperer of the front leading teams at the moment. So Perez, I would imagine, will stand a good chance. Going back to what Spanners said at the start of the show, Hamilton 10-1. Well, he was 11-1. For those that know how much I put outside bets on, and I do think that Mercedes will make a sizable leap forward based on these upgrades that they have come in and the track perhaps suiting them better in terms of the porpoising side of things. But I do think, based on what we saw from the new wing that Leclerc used in Canada, that they could potentially be up there as well. So I would put it in as Leclerc, Verstappen and Perez for my podium.
We've got Sean and Yasha coming up next with theirs.
Should I go first then? I guess I should. Silverstone, with regards to the Mercedes thing, when we got to Barcelona, I think the talk amongst us was, if they can't get it right here, they won't get it right anywhere this season, because they owned Barcelona just for the entire length of the hybrid era, and they've owned Silverstone for the length of the hybrid era. I mean, they've been fastest in Q3 at this racetrack for the last 10 consecutive races that we've had at Silverstone. They weren't on pole last year because of the sprint qualifying thing, but that becomes irrelevant because that's not the format we're using this weekend. So Mercedes always quick over a single lap at this racetrack. So if they can't get it right here, they wouldn't get it right anywhere. With that said, we thought that about Spain, and I was a bit underwhelmed by the improvements. You know, they did lead that race. Those are the only 4 laps they've led all year. So there might be incremental improvements, but experience leads me to say, look, all this, every time you hear this stuff, you know, it's going to be a massive leap forward, and then it's never quite as big as it is. Like, show me what that improvement actually is before I'm willing to believe it. So there's that. And also the fact that Ferrari, in the doldrums the last couple of years, in 2021, obviously all of the attention was taken by the lap one contretemps, shall we call it, between the championship protagonists, which left Charles Leclerc in the lead. But what we overlook in that, Leclerc was outstanding in Q3. Even in that car, which wasn't all that great, still put it fourth in qualifying in Q3 last year, and nearly led that. He nearly won that race. I mean, he came through in 3 laps of winning that race. Admittedly, Hamilton was delayed, but nonetheless, in that car that shouldn't have been up there, Leclerc was doing the business, and he's always been. He has a history of good results at this racetrack. So, I would be inclined to say expect Ferrari to be on top. Certainly, at the 1 lap pace in Leclerc's hands. There's no reason to believe that they couldn't take pole position because Leclerc is a ringer at Silverstone. And then it comes down to reliability. You know, it's strange to me. It's almost old-fashioned that we have this situation in Formula One right now where we can't trust the reliability of the leading teams. That's not something we've seen going back as far as when Parc Fermé was introduced at the end of qualifying, which is 2003. From then onwards, we've had this era of pretty much being able to trust the cars at the front of the field, a few exceptions, but to have both teams being a bit rickety, that adds a little bit of chaos theory, which I quite like. I quite like there's a little bit of old school nature for people of a certain age who remember that you couldn't always trust that the car was going to get to the line. So that would be the hope for Mercedes, I think, is that maybe the cars won't run to 100% of their potential because they might have to nurse some minor problems. And I also think this is not a stat, but just a general gut feeling. I don't think we'll see support for Lewis Hamilton this weekend like we've never seen at Silverstone before. Because obviously he was always super popular. You know, whenever he'd be put on pole, the roar would be massive. And then it'd be massive if he'd be third on the grid this weekend. Because firstly, after the week he's had, and secondly, after the season he's had. I mean, Britain is a country that loves the underdog. So there's no greater moment now for Lewis Hamilton, you know, back to the wall at a track where he's trying to win for the 9th time. No one's ever won at the same racetrack 9 times. So there is another bit of Formula One history on the table for Lewis this weekend. A long shot, but it is there.
That's why we have Sean Kelly on the panel for things like that we wouldn't know. Thank you, Sean. And Nasha, go on. I can predict what you're going to say, though.
If there's any ounce of justice in this world, Red Bull will have the worst weekend ever. That's all I want. I don't even care. Obviously, Lewis can do well. George can do well. I think I'm more invested in Red Bull's demise than Mercedes' own goodness this weekend. So that's what I'm going to put my energy into. Some people may say that's quite negative, may not be healthy, but that's where I'm at this weekend. So
wait a minute, who do you support?
I support Williams. Nicholas Latifi is my favourite driver. So, in all seriousness, I do think it's going to be a good weekend for Lewis. Hopefully, I think obviously there's talks of upgrades. I think everyone's bringing something, but I just think he's always electric around Silverstone, and if the conditions are stable and Mercedes are able to tune that car in, then I think this weekend could be something quite special. But I do think Ferrari, sure, they can't. Their car can't conk out again. So wary of them, but hopeful for Lewis. If I had to do a top three, probably Lewis, Leclerc, George.
Thank you, Nasha. And I mean, and we've got Dan, Engine Mode 11, who weirdly, because he actually seems like a nice person. Like I can't see. I think he's actually a genuinely good human, but he inexplicably still does actually support Red Bull. So Dan, go for it. You've got your hand up.
Yeah, I've got to balance out mid-stop F1 and say anyone but Mercedes, because I'll lose my beard if Mercedes win in a bet. So
this space is recorded, Dan, as well. So we're going to hold you to that.
People have screenshotted it, mate. If Mercedes win, the beard's coming off.
Dan, I'm just going to caution against that. I think your face needs that beard.
Yeah, I'm going to lose all my credibility and everything, but I haven't got much to begin with, to be fair.
Now, I would go to Alex Van Gien as our final speaker, but I don't know whether many people care what Alex has to say, and he doesn't seem to be putting his hand up. So it's at this point where we're going to go to our questions from the floor, and we're going to set a hard 15-minute limit on this because I really appreciate the time the panel have given from their evening already. So especially Sean, I know, is super busy. He's got his hand up. He's probably about to tell us that he needs to rush off and do a bunch of single-seater stat work.
No, all I was going to mention is there's one other wild card which I didn't mention, and that is the safety car. The last 10 years at Silverstone, there's been a safety car in every single British Grand Prix. The only exception was the anniversary Grand Prix of 2020. Wow. Therefore, a badly timed safety car could influence the result of this race. So we should also consider that. And, you know, Silverstone, not the easiest place on which to overtake. The overtaking numbers historically trend below the seasonal average. So you could end up with this situation. This is a nice thought to think about. Let's say, arbitrarily, a Mercedes driver, let's say, for argument's sake, Lewis Hamilton ends up in the lead because of a fortunate safety car, and you've got Verstappen behind him trying to overtake on a track that's really difficult to overtake. Now, that would be one hell of a British Grand Prix.
Fortunately, safety cars have been massively favouring Lewis Hamilton, so that's good news for the 44 fans.
I wanted to point out it was this variable which led me to predict Russell ahead of Hamilton, just because I've gotten used to, if something like that happens, it's going to benefit the guy I'm just not quite supporting as much. But that's a great shout as well, Sean. So we're going to open it up to some questions, and if possible, guys, because if you've ever experienced a Twitter space before, you'll probably have experienced questioners asking pretty long questions and speaking for 5 or so minutes. So if you could keep it to a short question, that would be awesome. And we'll let our panel answer. And we're going to try.
Yeah, and panel hands up. Panel, use the hands up if you want to answer the question as it comes in.
Absolutely. So we're going to try and put around about a 15-minute cap on this. So we'll try and keep these answers short. But does anybody have any questions for our expert panel? Hands up.
So I've just approved a couple of speakers there for you, Brad. We've got Mary, who is requested, and we've got VF1 as well. So VF1, you should be ready to speak. If you want to unmute yourself, say hi.
Yeah, can you hear me? I think.
Yeah, we can hear you. What's your question, bud?
Yeah, so I actually wanted to talk about the tyre situation that Summers mentioned about the Q3 rule. Have we already spoken about that for the coming years they'll have a strict mandatory tyre rules for the next year? Or maybe we've already covered that?
No, I don't think we have. Summers?
No, we haven't covered that. But as I mentioned earlier, some of the rules are changing regarding a new style of qualifying going into 2023. I think there's a lot up in the air with 2023 still anyway. But yeah, there is obviously regulations already set in place regarding the tyres and the allocation of the tyres going forward.
Yeah, but I agree with what he said earlier, that the last year's qualifying format where you had to use the Q2 tyres, that was actually better because a lot of teams had to risk it sometimes, that would they be able to make it on the mediums or not. And I think this year the most trouble would have been with Mercedes, even though that would have hurt the team that I really support. But either way, I really miss that format.
Thank you very much. And I think we've got Mary, who's a speaker with her hand up, waiting to speak.
Yeah, and now would be the time to request to be a speaker if you want to ask us something.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. I want to say that PK's sort of half-assed apology was total bullshit, and this is Lewis's time to win. This is his time. I'm unfortunately going to miss Silverstone this year for medical reasons, and this is the only twice I've missed Silverstone since 1983. But I can guarantee you I'll be the biggest supporter of Lewis ever. I want him to get pole. I want him to win. I want to see basically 2 fucks to Red Bull because they're all racist as well. I just want Lewis. They're all racist. But I want to say a quick point to Nasha. I've sent you the video that somebody mentioned about PK basically slagging off Senna. I've sent it to you directly. I tried to send it to you, Brad, but I couldn't. But yeah, that's my comment. I want Lewis to get one pole, get the win, get his 9th British Grand Prix win.
Thanks very much for that, Mary. And I would just caution just a little bit of restraint there, just because there have been a few individuals painting a whole team as racist. I don't think is very productive, and I think we should, like I said earlier, be mature enough to look at patterns of behaviour. We don't want to just write off a whole team. There's a lot of fantastic individuals at Red Bull, and we don't want that kind of backlash, especially coming from our community.
And Sean has something to say.
Yeah, I was going to ask Mary if she was. Did you say you were at the 1983 British Grand Prix?
She did, yeah. Sorry, I've removed her, but yes, she's 1983. Right. Well, who won that race?
Alain Prost, I think, won that race in '83, and that was the last British Grand Prix run on a Saturday, because British Grand Prix at Silverstone used to be run on Saturdays because they did not want to disrupt Sunday church services. Fun fact.
Do you know a similar thing to that in the Outer Hebrides? People will go around and they will lock up all the swings. So they will lock the chains together and make it so that children cannot play on the swings during church time, and they still do that.
You didn't think, folks, when you tuned in, we were going to get the Outer Hebrides into tonight's pre-British
Outer Hebrides and religion. And by the way, I didn't remove Mary from the space. I just removed her as a speaker. We have another questioner, Brad, which is Bob, ready to ask us a question.
Kind of a weird question, probably for Brad. I did some racing back many, many years ago, and our wet line used to be substantially different from the dry line, but it doesn't look like the Formula One guys have that different a wet line from the dry line. Am I correct, or am I misinterpreting?
I absolutely love this question. Thank you, Bob. This is awesome. This is the stuff I like to talk about. So yes, you're right, and not many people notice that. So we hear talk quite often about using the karting line in the wet and driving off the rubbered in line, which they will do sometimes. But essentially, the fastest way around a track in the wet, there is no hard and fast rule for this. You have to drive wherever the grip is, and on different types of asphalt, different types of circuit, it could be in all sorts of different areas. And it's down to the drivers to explore during the practice sessions and find the grip. It might be on the racing line. It might be miles off the racing line on all the dirty, horrible, rough stuff right around the edge. But the thing that's really different with Formula One, which might lead them to use the more dry, typical line, whereas other series, say touring cars or GTs, they'll be exploring a little bit more to find grip around the edge, away from the typical line. The thing that's different with Formula One is immense downforce. And also, these Formula One cars are pretty huge. Deviating from what would typically be the best line is sometimes a bit hard. They don't have a great turning circle, so you almost have to take this ideal optimum geometric line to get the damn thing to navigate the corner in anything like a decent fashion. But I'd say the number one thing which makes Formula One driving wet lines slightly different to other series, which Bob and I have probably experienced, is the fact that there is incredible downforce that helps them stick kind of regardless of what line they take. Therefore, it will skew slightly more towards the ideal standard line. I hope that goes some way to answering the question, Bob.
That did, because I'm from the zero downforce days.
And I largely, in my racing that I've done, Bob, don't have downforce either. Mainly in simulators nowadays, we have that, and we don't have very good wet weather in the Sims, so we don't have the opportunity to explore this. But I love that question.
Thank you,
More
sir.
of
That was
those,
a great
please.
answer.
Thanks, Bob.
And just before Bryson comes in, just if you want to ask a question, you've probably got time for one or two more. So now's the time to request to be a speaker.
Yeah, I can't speak too much about the complete racing line that they are or not using. But in Canada on Saturday, it was quite clear that all the drivers were more or less staying off of the curbs on the exit of turns 4 and I want to say turn 9. Yeah, they were definitely staying off the curbs there because, downforce or not, it was still treacherous in the wet.
And I'll add that when I go karting, Brad, and it rains, it's such a different sport to me that I just want to stop and get out. Like, what is it, about like the amateur type racer that once you lose the traction in the wet, it becomes almost undrivable. It's such a hard skill. Is it a big step in difficulty for professional drivers as well? It's just that you're used to it, or for a professional driver, your skills apply in the wet or the dry?
So I think the biggest thing is that obviously with the grip level being so much lower, you're relying a lot more of the time in the wet on your car control, because when you're dancing on the limit, the car is braking away from you so much more frequently than it does in the dry. In order to be fast, you have to be on or around that limit all the time, and that means corrections need to be happening absolutely subconsciously very frequently. And the better drivers in the wet are those that have supreme confidence in their ability, and they don't need to worry about potentially losing control because they know that 99.9% of the time their natural subconscious reaction will be the correct one, and they'll be able to control the car and make all the correct judgments. Whereas a more amateur driver, that isn't the case. In the dry, they've got enough grip that they're not often having to make those corrections. They can drive up to what feels like the limit or very close to it, and the vehicle, car, whatever it is, doesn't respond too badly most of the time unless you massively overstep the limit. Whereas when you reduce the grip level, make it wet, that limit is so much lower and the car is finding the limit so much more frequently. In order to be quick, you have to be able to make these quick corrections very, very frequently, and your feedback loop is working overtime in order to keep the car on that limit and keep control of it. So I know we've got a few requests. Let's take a couple more questions. I can't see any hands up.
We've got Caroline. We've got Caroline here.
Thanks,
who's selected as a speaker. It's all right. I've got you back. I'm your Roz to your Fraser today.
Exactly, and I'm losing.
Hello, Caroline.
At the same rate as Fraser.
Hello. So, what do you think might happen with Lewis this weekend in the jewelry?
Oh, that's a really good question. Yeah, because that's kind of that topic has fallen by the wayside a bit with other bigger news stories, I guess. I think this is a bit of a non-issue. I think the FIA will look extremely bad if, after the week Lewis has had, they start to try and penalise him or pull him up on wearing non-dangerous jewellery. And to put this in perspective, Hamilton doesn't wear a chain around his neck or anything that would be potentially dangerous. We're talking about a nose stud. We're talking about something, and when you look at Romain Grosjean, for example, who was subjected to extreme heat, fire in his accident, the one area of his hands that survived the burns was actually the part underneath his wedding ring. It actually protected him. So I think we can probably safely say that there is no inherent danger to having a nose ring, and I think we're being pretty pedantic if we are disqualifying, penalising, giving a fine to a driver for keeping that, especially when you are allowing other types of wedding ring style jewellery for other drivers. So I think it's a non-issue that won't really be talked about that much, but I could be wrong. Any thoughts, anyone else?
Brad, I just want to say that I think that those regulations and the enforcement of them are specifically and cynically targeted at Lewis Hamilton. So it's one of those things we were discussing earlier where, You can say, oh, it's being targeted at Lewis Hamilton. No, it's just a general safety thing. Oh, it's just a general jewelry thing. But we don't hear about, these equivalents, with other people. I do think this is specific to Lewis Hamilton. When it was about T-shirts, it was specific to Lewis Hamilton. Vettel can wear whatever T-shirts he wants. I think it's worrying the amount they've gone after this. Obviously, I don't have any evidence to back that up because we can't get into the brains of people, but I do not like it.
And just from an experience point of view, I've obviously competed in lots of races over the years where I've been scrutinized, and you get your equipment scrutinized, whether it's the car or your own race safety equipment. You have to give your race helmet and your suit and your boots and your gloves and your underwear over to be checked over. And I've never once had a watch questioned or any, I don't wear jewelry as a rule, but I have worn watches, and that would fall under the FIA's jewelry ban. And I've raced with a watch on and no one's mentioned it, and it's never been a problem. And so, yeah, I think this is a real non-issue personally that will hopefully be forgotten about. And this doesn't mean to say I don't care about the safety. And there are obviously items of jewelry which would pose a safety risk, which I would be behind them not allowing. But the drivers aren't stupid enough to wear those things anyway. Although I was surprised to hear about people not wearing the right underwear. That was quite a surprising thing, but I don't know too much about that.
You've got Sean Kelly from San Diego waiting to make a comment, and also Bryson from America Land.
Yeah, I would follow that up by saying, so what about drivers who wear glasses? Are they not allowed to wear glasses now?
Yeah, exactly. The onus is on the person who wants to make the claim that a particular item of jewelry is actually a safety issue. It shouldn't be assumed that any possible item of jewelry poses an equal threat to safety. There's clearly a spectrum here. I mean, we're not drivers aren't coming into the grid, dressed like Mr. T, right? I would be against that as well. But we're talking about minor things, studs and other things. The burden of proof is on the people making the claim that it's dangerous, not the other way around.
And I don't want to be facetious, but of course, you're not going to wear all this jewelry in a world where you're trying to take grams here and there off the weight of the car. You're not going to come in, like you said, looking like Mr. T. You're not going to wear a load of heavy jewelry knowing that there's an associated, if minute, weight penalty.
I think some people maybe get the false impression because drivers are handed a few things by their personal assistants or whomever after they get out of the car, sometimes watches, etc. I think sometimes people get the false impression that they are wearing those things in the car, but that isn't the case. They are generally given a bunch of stuff once they get out of the car, watch sponsors, etc. So anyway, I think you guys have covered that really well. I think at the risk of disappointing some people, we're going to wrap up there because everyone's given an awesome amount of time. I'm certainly under moderate spousal pressure to go and cook dinner, so I'm going to go and do that. But guys, I massively appreciate all of your input and expertise, and I hope we can do this again soon. And I hope all of your predictions, except Dan's, come true.
Yeah. Dan can shut up, and follow all the panel as well. Everyone that's listening to this, give everyone a follow, especially me. I'm the best one, but probably Brad as well. I do have to say, a great job hosting today, Brad. You've got excellent hosting skills. You are a natural.
Oh, thanks, Spanners. That's very kind. And thanks to everyone for joining and listening. This is a recorded space, so if you want to listen back, you can. Feel free, and obviously feel free to hit me or potentially the other panelists up in their on their feeds if you've got any further questions that we can answer in a future space. Guys, enjoy the British Grand Prix. Oh, Sean's got his hand up before we go.
Yeah, I just wanted to leave you with one stat. If we get to lap 44 of this race and Fernando Alonso's still in it, he'll set the all-time F1 record for the distance completed as an F1 driver. The record is Kimi Räikkönen, 57,536 miles, which converts as 92,596 kilometers. If Alonso's still running on lap 44 on Sunday, he's the new record holder.
Magic Alonso!